Facebook and just want to make sure that everything's working okay. Okay. Hi, wow. It's great to see everyone logging on. We're really excited to be with you this evening, and we'll be starting in just a few minutes, a couple more minutes. And in the meantime, while you're logging on, I think it'd be fun to see where you're all joining us from. So in the chat, just say hello to everyone and let us know where you're joining from. And you can use the chat, which is on the bottom. There you go. Great. So that's wonderful. I just got the heads up that we're live on YouTube and Facebook. Those are both Historic Hawaii Foundation pages. So for anyone who didn't register that you're in communication with, they can jump on either of those pages. You should be able to find that in a Google search. I don't have the links right now to put up on my screen, but easy to find. Wonderful. Okay, we're going to get started in just a maybe minute or so. I really find this so exciting to see everybody logging on. I know that you can all see that, but I just see the numbers rising and it's really fun. It's just great. I mean, in a time where we can't be together to be physically, to be able to do this. So I'm very grateful. So I'm going to get started just by doing an introduction and a welcome to everyone for joining us this evening. I realize people will be continuing to log on and that's fine. It's going to take a couple minutes to go through this and then we'll have our speaker begin. So again, aloha everyone. My name is Andrea Nandoskar and I'm the Education Program Manager at Historic Hawaii Foundation. And I want to thank you for joining us for today's virtual event, Return to Ula Ula, Fort Elizabeth. I also want to mention that the event is a collaboration and I want to send out a mahalo to Maureen Fodell and the Friends of King Kaumuali'i for helping to make this evening possible. Friends of King Kaumuali'i began formally in 2012, and their mission is to honor the last and great King Kaumuali'i of Kauai by erecting a life-size bronze statue of the king on a lava rock pedestal on a prepared site at Ula Ula, adjacent to the Russian fort site. Since its inception, Friends, a grassroots nonprofit, has raised funds and created educational and community events on Kauai annually for this purpose. And in 2018, with help from State Rep. D. Morikawa, Friends of King Kaumuali'i received a state grant in aid, which helped tremendously toward accomplishing this goal. What began with a marquette or 3-foot model created initially to envision this stream is now a recently completed 8-foot bronze statue en route to Hawaii from a foundry in Southern California with anticipated installation this winter. And just real quickly, before introducing our speaker, just a few virtual housekeeping items. Yes, we are recording on 3 platforms and you'll have ample opportunity to share any or all of those afterwards. And if you've registered, which you're on, so you did, or even if you couldn't be here tonight, you'll be receiving those links in a day or so. And we'll be posting it on our website as well on the event page for this event. If you have questions for the presenter during the talk and immediately afterwards, please type them in the Q&A box on the Zoom menu bar. And as I mentioned, we're live streaming. I think I mentioned on the HHF YouTube and Facebook channels. We are hoping to have at least 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the presentation, and we'll do our best to have our speaker address as many questions as possible. And Peter Mills has agreed graciously to stay a few minutes past to answer some additional questions. For those new to Historic Hawaii Foundation, we're a statewide nonprofit. We help people save historic places, sites that tell the stories of the multi-layered history of Hawaii. And we do this through education, advocacy, assistance, and protection of and for historic places. I'd now like to introduce and extend a warm welcome to today's speaker. Peter Mills is a professor of anthropology at the University of Hawaii at Hilo and a recipient of the University of Hawaii's Francis Davis Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching. He earned his PhD at UC Berkeley in 1996, which focused on ula ula on Kauai, a Hawaiian name for a fort in Waimea that is often labeled as a Russian fort. His book, Hawaii's Russian Adventure from UH Press 2002, has helped place the site in a Hawaiian cultural context and demonstrates that Hawaiians built and occupied the fort under the direction of King Komolei as part of the king's own residential complex. Mills serves as the director of the Heritage Management MA program at UH Hilo and has served as the president of the Society for Hawaiian Archeology. He is the author of over 50 articles pertaining to Hawaiian history and archaeology. We hope you enjoy his presentation.
All right, I just unmuted my mic. Andrea, thank you so much for that sort of extended context there for everybody, and thanks to everyone else for showing up tonight. I know myself, with COVID, I've sort of worked my way through Netflix, and I found the Historic Hawaii Foundation presentations earlier, and it's just a wonderful program you put together, and I'm really honored to have a chance to participate in it, especially at this timely point when the state is discussing how to best reinterpret this site to better represent the multicultural history of this really incredible place. So anyway, without further ado, let's sort of launch in. I want to give you a little bit of background on how I got into this, and a little bit of background on some of the ongoing things that have been underway, in addition to the Friends of King Komolei coming up with this wonderful plan to get this statue of the king on in this particular state park. And I hope by the end of this presentation, you'll understand why that is such an appropriate place to put this particular monument. All right, everybody can see my slides? Andrea, everything looks good? Okay, off we go. All right, so first up, back in the 1980s, I was in my mid-20s, and I had just finished a master's in the American Southwest in anthropology, working on sort of Southwestern cultures, but I got the chance to go up and work doing oral histories and archaeological site survey in Alaska as part of what was called the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. And as part of that sort of me, I'm sorry, I'll do this. That's me in the blue sort of survival jacket there in front of a Bell Jet Ranger. I was on a roving crew. Lots of people get to Alaska and get stuck in the salmon canneries. I got to fly around most of southern Alaska, mostly coastal Alaska, interviewing elders in fish camps, and all incredible experience, and then surveying old sites at the time. One of the places where we were working was Kodiak Island. This is Spruce Island right off of Kodiak Island in Ninilchik, two Russian Orthodox churches up there that relate back to sort of 19th century history. And this Russian Orthodox cross is at a sort of a remote place. It's actually a National Historic Landmark called Three Saints Bay, where originally the Shelikov Company set up, and then the original headquarters of a company called the Russian American Company, which started out here, moved its headquarters to Sitka or New Archangel, Alaska. And I was just fascinated by this history of colonialism and the relationships between this fur trading company and indigenous people up there. And I really thought that's what I was going to do for my dissertation work, was go up to Alaska and be an archaeologist up there. But the ground would freeze in Alaska. and my job would run out up there in the middle of the winter. And I had other friends down in Hawaii, and I started working at the Bishop Museum. So here's just sort of a classic photo of Matsumoto Shave Ice, sort of this iconic place on the North Shore, and me sort of in that era. And I went to this was right before starting grad school at Berkeley for my PhD. And I went to Berkeley pretty much to work on the Russian American company and picturing that I was going to work in Alaska. But then I met another professor there, Patrick Kirch, who has deep ties to Polynesia, and he had money and he put me to work in his lab, and I was working on Cook Islands material. And I really loved my professor who was working on the Russian American company stuff, Kent Lightfoot. But I realized that I had a way to combine my interests in both what Pat Kirch specialized in and Kent Lightfoot. And I thought it was the best possible dissertation topic. So this site on Kauai that was associated with the Russian American company, that's always been known, at least in the historical era, as Russian Fort Elizabeth State Historical Park, sort of became my focus. Before I even had a chance to get there, I'd also had the chance to work with Professor Kent Lightfoot at Berkeley in 1992 at Fort Ross, doing a large field school at a Native Alaskan village site where 80 Native Alaskan men had come down and were living as Russian American company employees outside the stockade walls. And it was a really wonderful chance to see the multi-ethnic composition of the Russian American company. You had some people who were ethnic Russians at sort of at the top, and they had Promishlnik. You had Creoles who were intermarried with Native Alaskans. And then you also had many Native Alaskan employees as well. And 80 of them had moved down to Northern California, just a little north of San Francisco. You'd picture 80 Native Alaskan men living with Kashaya Pomo women and establishing these new communities on the California coast. And so when I envisioned coming down here to Hawaii and working on ula ula, I was picturing again this sort of this multi-ethnic composition of this site and how to best express that. So if you know Kauai, this is old news to you. But if you're tuning in from somewhere else, you might not be aware. You sort of get into Kauai at Lihue, and you sort of can drive around in a matter of, well, depending on how bad the traffic is, you can drive around in about a half an hour sometimes and get over to this town of Waimea. And as you're coming down the highway, one of the things you used to see, the signs changed a little bit and now it says Waimea underneath it. But back then in the early 1990s, it just said Russian Fort. And you picture, just for the typical American tourist, how sort of interesting that would be, and how it's like you can sort of picture the conversation. Russian Fort in Hawaii, what's that all about? And you pull in and there's another sign, Russian Fort Elizabeth State Historical Park. And you can pull into that park, and that the signs there will sort of tell you the story that of the Russian American company and their engagement with King Komolei down on Kauai. I was far from the first to ever look into this subject. It's really, there's a wonderful book that came out in the 1960s by a historian named Richard Pierce. And he wrote a book called Russia's Hawaiian Adventure. And what's so wonderful about it is that he went to all the work to check all of the archival material that he could find in Russia and stored at UC Berkeley, and translate it and publish it as part of what eventually became his own sort of press series for a Russian American company, stuff called Limestone Press. He published a book called Russia's Hawaiian Adventure. And as I started to read that book, it's telling the story of Dr. George Anton Scheffer, who in 1815 came down very late in 1815 to Hawaii to try to recover goods from the wrecked Russian American company vessel, the Bering, which had wrecked right on Kauai, right about where this fort was eventually built, and how he had signed treaties with King Komolei, and that Komolei had sworn allegiance to the Russians and to Russia, to the emperor, had raised a Russian flag and had started building forts. And so one of the forts that was built is the one that we're talking about. There were actually 3 forts that were built. But I noticed something that was lacking in these Russian documents and in the interpretation and the way that they were being sort of framed in that history. The opening paragraph, which is sort of tattooed in my head after 20 years on this subject, from Richard Pierce. Again, I think he did a great job of translation and pulling together the documents that existed from the Russian side. But his opening introduction was, here we go, the Pacific Ocean, all but empty of sail until Cook's epic making voyages in the 1770s became in little more than a generation the scene of a thriving and far-flung commerce. And that phrasing, looking at it as in the 1990s and trying to understand multi-ethnicity, the phrasing of the Pacific Ocean, all but empty of sail until Cook showed up, struck me right away as something that was sort of peripheralizing anything to do with Polynesian agency or Polynesian action or Polynesian things. The Pacific Ocean was not empty of sail until Cook. And that is a point that any Polynesian reading a book on Kauai would immediately turn to and go, whoa, who's being written out of this story? And once you realize that, you look at the title and you see that the title has a possessive on the word Russia. Who's having the adventure? Russians are having the adventure. And so immediately the framing is one being told from a Russian perspective. And honestly, Pierce's book does a wonderful job of explaining the Russian perspective. And I didn't try to rewrite his book, and I refer to it all the time. It's a really valuable resource. But there's another part to this story, and I realized that's what my dissertation could be about, which is instead about writing about what Russians were doing and how they were having an adventure, is I wanted to write about Hawaii and King Komolei and how this place fit into their history and into their culture, and what ownership of that event did they have. And together, that's what these two books, I see them as complementary. We have Russia's Hawaiian adventure and Hawaii's Russian adventure, and neither one by itself tells the whole story. So in 1993 and 1994, with little funding, but I set up field schools through UC Berkeley, and that's how we did our dissertation work. I had come down, the 93 field schools stayed up at a place called Koke'e State Park. Marcia Erickson recently passed away, hosted us and really helped us have a place to go to that was cool and out of Waimea at the end of the day. And then in 94, we came back with a smaller crew. Mostly in 93, we worked outside the fort walls, and in 94, we came back and worked inside. And so if you want a picture, there's let's see if I can get this, come on, little thing. There we go. There's Patrick Kirch, Kent Lightfoot back there with the San Francisco Giants hat on. Let's see who else can we, I won't pick out everybody here. And then here's our 94 crew. That's me again with the big sort of hat on in the background, and our screens and sort of our 94 crew working inside there. As we did this work in the community, we gave sort of weekly talks, and different people came out. Mike Faya, many of you probably know from Kauai, had actually pieces of the rudder from the wreck of the Bering, which had been stored in his garage. And Dr. Jim Allen, a nautical archaeologist, came out and helped record some of those details. And there was really a good sense of community involvement. I met Auntie Alitha Ke'ohi on Kauai during this project. And again, she has direct genealogical ties back to King Komolei. And it was really nice to have a project starting to connect with community in different places. And so we did the field work, but there was also a lot more ethnohistory that I wanted to do. And one of the problems with interpreting this particular site is that the very first map we have of it doesn't come from the Russian period or the Russian era. In fact, it comes from, the Russians were gone by 1817, and we'll cover that. But what ended up happening between 1817 and 1862, 1864, is the place was occupied by the Hawaiian monarchy as a fort through that whole time. And it was abandoned about that time. And then in 1885, again, another full 20 years after even the Hawaiian episode had ended in terms of actual use, you had a Hawaiian government surveyor, George Jackson, come in and draw a map of the place. And when he drew the map, there was a newspaper article that came out at the time, and the map said, and the newspaper article said, George Jackson didn't draw it as he saw it. He drew it as he imagined it was at the time that the Russians were there. And so he put labels on all sorts of things in there, like barracks and magazine and armory and guard room, and out here trading house. And just as an example of the problems with this map from 1885 is that we'll focus on this trading house out here. Now, there were Hawaiian soldiers who were stationed here between the 1817 and the 1860s, and one of them was named Pa'ele. And Pa'ele was the commandant of the fort about the time of the Mahele in sort of 1848, 1850s. And he also made a claim to his house site. And he described his house site in terms of where it is. And so that's what you're reading down here below. It says Mauka, or in other words, sort of up towards the mountains, which is going up this way from his house site, is the lands of Komo'oli'i. And then towards Hanapepe, which is sort of running into the fort walls, you have Hanapepe, Papu. That's the name for a fort. And then the name after it is Pa Ula Ula. Now notice here that even though Schaefer called it Fort Elizabeth, we have no record of Komolei or any of the Hawaiians who were there calling it Fort Elizabeth ever, but they do have their own names for it. So here is this buried part of the history of this place in terms of its Hawaiian significance. There are Hawaiian names for this place other than the name for Russian in Hawaiian is like Lukini, and it's not called Papu Lukini, it's not called Russian Fort. There's another name, Pa Ula Ula. And then if you head sort of Makai, or sort of towards the ocean, which is sort of coming this way, there's a lie or a point. And the point is called Hipo, and then also and Papu. So in other words, if you head from Pa'ele's house towards the ocean, you run into the fort and you run into this place or this point that's called Hipo. And then if you go Mana, towards the Mulivai, that's the river of Waimea. So what this is describing and about the only place it can be to run into the fort this way, run into the fort that way, run into the river this way, is this location right here, which is Pa'ele's house. And so we know that that is not the Russian trading house, but Pa'ele's commandant's house. And in fact, when we went back and we did the archaeology, I'm sorry, I'll skip ahead one. We found that we worked on that foundation, found an imu, with sort of foodstuffs, fish, pig, dog, you know, all the typical ili paving, all of the typical things that you see on a house floor, and it matches up perfectly with that being Pa'ele's house and not a Russian trading house. So I'm sorry to bounce back and forth. I'll try to minimize that. So even though there would have been people alive in Waimea in 1885 who would have remembered Pa'ele, we can see that this government surveyor didn't even speak to the people in the community to come up with these labels, and it's his fanciful creation of what this place was. Now, beyond that, this map gets picked up by Hawaiian historians like W.D. Alexander, who published this map again in 1892, and it works itself into the Russian scholars' setting. So when Richard Pierce wanted to draw and show an image of this site in his book, Russia's Hawaiian Adventure, it was this site, which is really an amalgam of features that cover many things after the Russian American company was there, and the labels themselves of what was in the fort are quite spurious, right? We can prove that in lots of different ways. All right, so into this mix comes a collaboration I built up with Dr. Alexander Molodyn, he was an architectural historian in Novosibirsk, and he's sort of moved into the Americas now. But we spent years working on this together. But as he was reading the Russian documents and trying to do 3D reconstructions of the site based on what he understood from the limited maps that he had available to him, he immediately went to the Jackson map and other things, and he drew this trading house outside of the fort in his 3D reconstruction. And he drew it with redwood and with glass pane windows and all of the things that you would picture for a Russian trading house. And so I just wanted to demonstrate to you how in public interpretation, you can end up going from something that was very different on the ground from what you end up seeing in broad scale public interpretation. And so Molodyn and I worked together for years to try to get a better representation of what a three-dimensional reconstruction of this place would look like. And by the time we were done, this is what Alexander ended up drawing outside. And so this to me shows the wonderful sort of collaboration between people who can speak and read Russian documents directly and those working with Hawaiian texts to try to recreate better representations of what places were. Right? So if Alexander, if you're out there, thank you so much for all of that. And not only that, but we had in 2017, you have sort of the 200th anniversary of this fort. And Alexander Molodyn and other groups helped pull together this conference on Kauai, and it was focused on this fort. And again, the name there was Fort Elizabeth in the forum, but participation came from all sorts of different people. And so it's been, with the 200th anniversary, it's been a hot subject again. But it sort of also became testy, because as I'm trying to talk about this other name and this other history for this place, some of the Russian scholars really started to get sort of concerned about it. And for instance, this is a quote from one sort of Ruski Mir sort of translation to English about this particular site, and one particular diplomat who really did not like this idea of a local historian like me discussing renaming the fortress with Pa Ula Ula and why that might be important. And it says it's now referred to as Russian fort, and he finds that tendency worrying. In particular, Professor believes that Russians played a secondary role, and Orloff has underlined that this position does not appeal to him. Local population were just labor force at construction. And so that phrase to anybody who comes from a Hawaiian cultural background. And again, maybe Orloff did not say this. This is a newspaper story, and we never know what actually is said by people. But this particular position is one that creates fighting words, right? In terms of representing history at a particular place. What role did Hawaiians have in this place, and how was it different from being a Russian fort? There were letters, online campaigns started, sort of Congress of Russian Americans wrote that we believe renaming of the park is not necessary and against historical factual documentation. And the response to that from the Hawaiian Civics Club was a resolution urging the state to just rename it ula ula and get Russian fort completely off of it, just get that name out of there. And so you start to see this kind of divisive representation of the past. And really what I think Dr. Molodyn and I and many other people on both sides of the Pacific have been trying to work to do is find a good common ground to represent all history as best as we can without emphasizing one side or another. It got so heated that the head ambassador to the US, Anatoly Antonov, wrote a letter to state parks, again, trying to stress that they want that word Russian to stay on this state park name. And so that's, again, another part of the ongoing history. So anyway, I just wanted to point out that there is that sort of ongoing controversy. There's been working groups that have been trying to resolve these issues. And what I want to return to for you guys for the remaining parts of the hour that I have here is to less than an hour, is to talk about what we have physically from the ethno history and the archaeology. So it's not just me working on it. I just want to point out David Wellman is a guy who's been really doing a lot with his wife of digital elevation model building. And we're starting to get these really beautiful representations of the physical remains on the ground. And I want to, again, emphasize a sort of one Hawaiian phrase that I like a lot in this case. If we're trying to understand what this place is and was, the phrase nana ike kumu, like to look to the source, is one that we can go back to rather than looking at it just through Russian documents or just through what people remember from the local communities. We have the place itself to look at. And I think that's one of the big places where archaeology can fit in. Let's go back to the ethno history and broaden it a little bit. So when I was doing my dissertation work, one of the things I was interested in doing to tell Hawaii's Russian adventure is understand this place where ula ula existed. What significance did it have to the people of Hawaii? How was that landscape before this place was ever constructed in the form that we see today? And one of the things that we have to turn back to are these wonderful sketches from a surgeon on Captain Cook's voyages, William Ellis. There are actually two William Ellises in Hawaii that people hear about. One is a missionary from the 1820s, a London Missionary Society guy, and the other is this surgeon. But William Ellis was he drew watercolors, and he drew two watercolors that have survived to today. One's at the Bishop Museum, and the other is at the Turnbull Library in Wellington, New Zealand. And I've zoomed in on the Wellington one a little bit, but I've zoomed out on the one from Bishop Museum. And the first thing I want you to see are hundreds and hundreds of houses here on the west bank of the Waimea River. This is the Waimea River right here. And this green box is around where ula ula Fort Elizabeth was eventually built. And if you can sort of see on this one at the Bishop Museum, there's this tall tower on the east bank of the Waimea River up there, which is described in the Cook Journals as being a very large and significant heiau on the east bank. There's another heiau on the west bank that John Weber, an artist, drew that's become very famous because of the drawing. But there were at least these two Luakini heiau along the Waimea River, one on the west bank and one on the east bank. And if you look at where the fort was actually built, which is right where my cursor's landing, it's pretty much open grassland where there's hundreds of houses over here on the west bank. And now that's an interesting thing to consider because this is prime real estate. This is like the largest river source on the west side of Kauai. And you've got all these houses on the west bank. And wait, what is that? What is that over here on the east bank? If you go in on the Wellington one, you can see again, we're zoomed in. Here's where the fort was built. And right over here on the east bank, you see a smaller cluster, a densely packed cluster of relatively large houses on the east bank that Ellis has penciled in at that point. And so I'm about to get to what I think those houses are, but you do have at least a few houses on the east bank when the Cook expedition got there, but largely this upraised place where the fort was built doesn't have a lot of houses on it, and a huge village you've got on the other side of the river. So let's go another decade later, and you've got the Nathaniel Portlock and George Dixon expedition, which comes in British traders. Nathaniel Portlock had actually been on the Cook expedition. But when they come back in, they've got two vessels, the King George and Queen Charlotte. When they come through, there are a couple of things in those journals or the sailors who were on that voyage, which I just find fascinating. One is that Harry Humphrey, who was out there with the expedition, he described going from the village on the west bank to the east bank and going 200 yards along the shore to get to Kaʻeokulani's house. Now, Kaʻeokulani is Ali'i Nui at this point. He is basically, along with his wife, Kamakahele, they are the two ruling chiefs, and he is the father of Komolei, who we've already been talking about. And so his royal compound, at least on this part of the island, is being described as 200 yards along the east bank from the Waimea River, which is pretty close to what we see in that Ellis drawing from a decade earlier. Not only that, but there's a gentleman, a traveler on the expedition named William Beresford. And I want to read you his account because you can he was the supercargo. So he wasn't a common sailor, but he was sort of writing what he was doing. And this hopefully won't take too long. And pardon my eyes losing contact here. But when I got along the banks of the river, one of the natives was paddling backwards and forwards in a small canoe, seemingly to his amusement. On this, it occurred to me that a cruise by water would be of an agreeable variety and perhaps give me an opportunity of seeing of the country on the opposite shore. And more explicitly, of the side of the hill directly facing me, there was a high wooden pile, seemingly of a quadrangular form, which I wished to examine. A couple of nails engaged my new waterman, and he took me with pleasure as a passenger. Next, I could not prevail on the man to land me near the place I have just been speaking of. He gave me to understand the pile I was desirous to see was a morai, a place where they buried their dead, and that he durst not go near it, right? And so you're starting to get this sense of this division between this large village on the west bank and the east bank being associated with the chiefs, being elite, being sacred. And if you read the book that I put out in 2002, there are many other examples of that sort of set the context for this landscape. It wasn't just a tabula rasa, blank slate. And to any Hawaiians who were carrying stones in 1816 to help build this structure, they knew the landscape that they were standing on, and they understood its connection through their genealogies to their own community. And that's part of the story of this place, and a state park should be able to express that. One of the other things that was really, for me, just a big bombshell that I felt super excited as a grad student to find is anybody who reads Hawaiian history will learn that King Komolei had become sort of a subordinate to King Kamehameha in 1810 when he went over to Oahu and offered up Kauai to King Kamehameha, who had conquered at that point all of the other islands, and that Komolei had sort of become someone who would bring tribute to King Kamehameha, but Komolei still got to maintain his political control on the islands of Kauai and Ni'ihau, and that was a different kind of agreement than even any other part of the islands. But what sort of knocked me off my feet was at the Massachusetts Historical Society coming across a journal of an American who, during the War of 1812, had sold his ship, the Atahualpa, to the Russians, and it became the Bering, which is about to wreck. But he was a former member of the Atahualpa, and all of the stuff that they had from their own trading of the Atahualpa was stored by King Komolei in Waimea, and they were just waiting for the chance to miss the British gunboats and get all of this stuff to China and sell it. But he's hanging out in Waimea with King Komolei during the War of 1812. And this is just one of his entries from his journal, right? And I'm not going to expect you to read it. And so again, I'll read it for you, and I've read it hundreds of times. So it's referring to American traders and American vessels, but here it goes. So this is the 18th of March, 1814. Fresh trades and clear at 9 a.m. arrived the ships Isabella and Pennsylvania Packet, Captain Davis and Meek, last from Oahu. Captain Davis informs us that Kamehameha, king of the Windward Islands, was making every preparation for invading this island. As of late, Komolei, king of this place, has refused paying him a tribute, which was granted him by the king at the last settlement of national affairs, which was concluded through the intercession of Mr. Thomas Robinson in 1810. So what this is referring to is that during the War of 1812, Komolei broke his alliance with Kamehameha. He had American cannons and gunpowder and munitions stored there during the War of 1812, and he decided to reassert his sovereignty, and that now Kamehameha had plans to come back and attack the island. The journal goes on to mention 17 chiefs who were loyal to the Kamehameha lineage that Komolei packed up on canoes and shipped back to Oahu. And so during this era, that means that Komolei had already broken his alliance before the Russians were ever on the scene. The War of 1812 ended in 1814. News of it got out here in 1814, and the Americans left, and suddenly Komolei was alone. And then just literally weeks later, you have the Russian vessel now, the Bering, wrecking right in front of his kauhale, the one described as Ka'eokulani's earlier in Waimea, dropping all of the cannons and munition and gunpowder, just basically keeling over right on shore. All of that stuff was collected by Komolei. He kept it. And then the Russians sent down Schaefer to negotiate its return. Within literally weeks of Schaefer arriving on Kauai, you have Schaefer and Komolei signing an alliance that would reestablish the sovereignty of Kauai. Komolei had done all of that in the year before Schaefer ever shown up, and the Americans had left him. The Russians made a perfect, convenient a foreign ally that he could use for the same agenda, right? So it wasn't Schaefer that talked Komolei into this. It was the opposite way around. When that happened, all sorts of land agreements were being made with Schaefer and the Russian-American company. Some were right in Waimea, and one, in fact, was right where this fort that we're talking about was built. But when Schaefer got up to the north shore of Kauai, he saw the Hanalei district up there, Halelea, green, verdant, lush. And Schaefer was really interested in agriculture and planting stuff and making sure that it can grow. And Schaefer saw the area which we call Princeville today, and Komolei, and said, "Gosh, that's really beautiful." And Komolei gave him the entire district of Hanalei. And up there, Schaefer started to build a fortification that you can still see parts of today, right out front of the valet parking of the Princeville Hotel. Sort of in this graph, there's like, if you see this photo, there's an earthen berm here, which is basically the remnants of this wall around what Schaefer called Fort Alexander, which is named after the emperor. And so if you just look at Schaefer's name choices, you've got the entire district where he's planning to do agriculture up on the North Shore, and you've got King Komolei, who's having this fort built right as part of his own residential compound down in Waimea on the outside that he calls Fort Elizabeth, which is the name of the consort of Alexander, but not the name of the emperor himself. And I think that sort of points to Schaefer seeing Alexander as the center of the Russian-American company activities on Kauai, or at least part of the things that point to it. This is intended to be a somewhat humorous sort of map of, you guys know Where's Waldo? It's sort of like a puzzle thing where you find this character Waldo in a very crowded scene. And I took Schaefer's journal from Richard Pierce, and Alexander also translated his own version of it, and trying to put together where Schaefer was in the 2 years that he was in the islands. And all the greens represent him being on the Big Island. The blues represent him being on Oahu. The oranges represent when he got to the island of Kauai for the first time. The big T's that you see right here are the treaties that he signed with Komolei. And right here is when this fort in Waimea starts to be built that Schaefer called Fort Elizabeth at the time. He said, "I name it Fort Elizabeth, and this other one's named Fort Alexander." We don't know what Komolei is calling it, but it's largely Native Hawaiian laborers who are going to work building it. So all of the yellows that you see, the bright yellows with the orange circles, represent days that Schaefer is actually in Waimea while the fort is being constructed, okay? And all of the purples represent Hanalei when he's up at Fort Alexander. So you can see him splitting his time between these two major centers. And then the other things that you have are these H's are when he's at Hanapepe, where there were some other agricultural plots that he'd picked up. And the big circles here sort of represent times where we're not quite certain where he is. He was at sea, and then it's really hard to figure out, but he shows up again in Hanalei, at least by the beginning of April. Anyway, I just want to point out that's all of the time that Schaefer was in Kauai, in Waimea, while this fort was still being constructed. So the idea that Russians had built it by themselves and had occupied it for 2 years is really misinterpreting what was going on as far as the history. This circle right here represents when Schaefer was evicted by force by King Komolei from the island of Kauai. And the reason why Schaefer was evicted was two things. One is that Schaefer had promised to buy a vessel for Schaefer, for Komolei. But he wrote to Baranov in Alaska, the governor of the Russian American Company. And on this date right here, Baranov's letter gets down to Schaefer and to Komolei saying, I am not purchasing this American vessel Avon for any sort of deal that you're talking about. That is done with. And then right here on this date is when Schaefer learns that Otto von Kotzebue, a Russian naval officer who had been visiting with King Kamehameha on the Big Island, sailed off from the Hawaiian Islands, never stopping at Kauai and renouncing any sort of association with the Russian American Company. And there are all sorts of these tensions between the Russian Navy and the Russian American Company, but clearly Komolei had learned at this point that he didn't have the backing of the Russian Navy and that he couldn't get the things that Schaefer had promised. And shortly after then is when Komolei kicked the Russian American Company off of the island. And so all of that is the story in brief. You really should read Pierce's book to get the whole story. But anyway, don't think in your head that the Russians occupied this fort for one day. In 1820s, what we end up having is the missionaries, the first Protestant missionaries showing up. Komolei is living right outside the fort, and we start to get lots of historical records about what's going on in there in the 1820s. One of the things that Mercy Whitney writes about in the 1820s is the death of Komolei's grandson, the son of Humehume, who was just an infant at the time, and having his body taken inside this thing that we've been calling for generations a Russian fort and burying him inside of it. And so how does that fit into the idea of Russian military architecture? It means something very different to the Hawaiian people who built it. Again, this is when it was being built as part of Komolei's own compound. Schaefer's journal refers to him helping design things, but at the same time, the labor force was overwhelmingly Native Hawaiian. And included in that labor force at some points were also Komolei's own wives, sacred chiefesses carrying pohaku to put this place together. And that, again, is not just, they were not just laborers for the Russian American Company, right? There is something culturally significant about this place and this event that's tied into Hawaiian culture. Beyond that, right up to the period of 1819, King Komolei was still living under kapu. He was still following traditional kapu practices, and that has to do with warfare and alliance building. And it's just too much to go into. But my point is that when Komolei and the people of Kauai were building this large stone monument, even though they're using some Western designs to it, they were doing something which was very parallel to Luakini heiau construction prior to warfare. So if you read all of the entries that we have for the time and try to understand what this place looked like in 1817 when Schaefer left, we have this entry from Samuel Whitney. The fort was not completed under the doctor's direction, but so far finished that a number of guns were mounted on one side, the magazine built, and the flagstaff erected, on which Russian colors were seen flying on public occasions. So in Dr. Molodyn's rendering with all of this background history, you can sort of see what's being described there of the walls on one side being completed, a magazine at the center, and a flagstaff. So that's pretty much what had been completed by the time that the Russian American Company had left the island. The other thing to point out that's really not in this rendering is that King Komolei's kauhale is right here. And right, so you can sort of picture, if you were King Komolei and you were mounting guns here all along this, and your royal compound that you're living in is right here, who would you want staffing this fort? You know, whose fort is this, right? Just connecting the dots. So by the 1820s, we have really clear descriptions that not only did King Komolei continue living outside of this fortification, but that he had built a semicircular stone wall that was 10 feet tall that surrounded the main portions of his kauhale. And so again, this is Dr. Molodyn's wonderful 3D rendering for sort of for the early 1820s when Komolei was still there. And I think these are just beautiful, and it's wonderful to have this collaboration to try to put these together and show this overall landscape rather than just focusing on the stone walls of the fortification. So the history of this place, 1820s, Komolei stays there. 1820, Hume down here, Komolei's son, who had actually been raised in Boston for the most part, who couldn't even remember how to speak Hawaiian, comes back with the missionaries, and And he is again trying to reassert his place in Hawaiian culture and in the Hawaiian political structure. And Komolei at first is very amenable to that. Komolei dies in 1824, and in 1824, a lot of Kauai chiefs who were still loyal to Kauai and loyal to Hume mount a rebellion, because at that point, by 1824, Komolei had married Queen Ka'ahumanu, the widow of Kamehameha I, and was largely living on Oahu at the time. And so you have this political tension between the Kamehameha loyalists, mostly on Oahu, and the Kauai loyalists, including Hume on Kauai. And the largest battle between these chiefs in this era takes place beginning right at the fort, when Hume loyalists attack the fort, kill the loyalists to Kamehameha who were inside, or some of them. At least 6 people died in that battle. And then the Kalaimoku, who's Kalani Moku, comes over in order to support the King Kamehameha lineage. And Kalani Moku and all of his other Kamehameha loyal people prevail, and it becomes basically the property of that's in my mind, the big unification of the Hawaiian Islands, when the Kamehameha loyalists really gain political control in person on the islands of Kauai and Niihau. And then pretty much from that battle in 1824 to the 1850s, King Kauikeoli, King Kamehameha III, is the one who is really basically administrating control of this fortification. And this whole place that we're talking about, this National Historic Landmark, has this decades-long history of use as this sort of continuing center of government on the island of Kauai for the island. It's in this era, again, that we know that I mentioned Komolei's grandson was buried inside in 1821. We know of at least 3 people who were buried inside the fortification in 1824 following the battle. And then also in the 1830s and 1840s, high-ranking chiefs on the island of Kauai, we have records of several of them also being buried inside. The fort was used as a prison at some point. It was certainly used as a governmental administrative center. There were soldiers who were stationed there who would do drills and fire off cannons when different ships were coming in and out of the harbor. So all of that use is archaeologically accumulated inside this place. And keep in mind that this structure here looked like it was the original magazine at the fort. And you see these structures that Dr. Patrick McCoy and his team, Neil Crozier, drew this map in 1970s. And you can sort of see what looked like burials on the side of this original magazine platform inside. It wasn't the only fort built in Hawaii in this era. Contemporaneous with the construction of ula ula, Fort Elizabeth on Kauai, you have the building of Kekuanohu on the island of Oahu in downtown Honolulu that Fort Street is named after. Again, Thorny Back is sort of the translation of that. And you can see this drawing done by one of the artists that was with Katsubu, Louis Choris, who was with the Rurik in 1817. So you can sort of see this structure that was built there by John Young and Kalani Moku and others. There are rumors that people float that this was started by the Russians. They show up in the 1890s. None of the original Russian documents suggest that the Russians were busily building a fortification on Oahu. They do talk about them raising a flag and doing some other things in parts of Honolulu that had ticked off the Hawaiian monarchy, but there's no evidence that they had started building a fort there. Also, if you look at this, again, this name ula ula, if you take a look through the 1850s, we have the Mahele documents where lots of Hawaiian soldiers were placing their land claims. And so you can look to see, and a lot of them describe owning claiming kula, dryland agricultural plots and having pahale, or their houses outside the fort, but they don't mention living inside. And they refer to the fort both as ula ula and also as hi po, which is a name that Kamakaua uses as well. But hi po is also used to refer to the point of land, as you saw in that one Mahele testimony. When we got there to do the archaeology, what you see on the left is lots of sugarcane outside that had built up outside in the 1950s. And so we didn't expect to find anything other than plowed ground outside. But one of the big things we wanted to address, along with previous surveys that were done by Bishop Museum and state parks in the 1970s, was whether or not Ellis's map looked accurate. Did we find basalt chipping debris from making adzes and using materials or shells or anything else that would have been durable that lasted all that plowing? And really the answer is no, that we don't see the kinds of signs of domestic Hawaiian life on the East Bank that you find all over the place on the West Bank. So again, that corroborates the idea that you do still have signs of Kaʻeokulani's residence down along the coastline over here. On the inside, when we looked at the architectural materials and the dating of artifacts, it looked like this is pretty much the 1840s out here. Keep in mind the Russian-American company left in 1817. These buildings were built in the 1830s. This was probably the original magazine and flagstaff that were referred to. In the middle of that large original magazine, one of the coolest things that turned up archaeologically was that underneath this, if you look where this red arrow is here, we found little bits of stone, and we started a small test unit, and I started digging upside down along with my crew, trying to get deeper in this thing in 95-degree heat in the middle of July in Waimea. And the hole kept on getting deeper, and we could follow those little stones of this adobe wall down. They went down 2 meters. And so there was a cellar that was underneath this structure here. And the cellar had a pretty empty floor where we dug into it, but it looks like it was purposely filled with adobe blocks. Off to the north side of this platform is one of these later structures from the 1830s or 1840s, and there's lime plaster, a new architectural material that was a huge fad in the 1830s and 1840s that was there. And that looks like that became the new magazine for the fort where gunpowder was stored during the Hawaiian era. Off to this side, you see another cluster of lime plaster. The size of the L indicates how much plaster we're returning. The bigger the font, the more plaster. Unlike this one where there's pretty much no sign of domestic debris, this one had pieces of case gin bottles, bangles from lamps, glass beads, little nails from shoes, and slate writing pieces. And so this was interpreted as a guard room. Not a bad interpretation. That one looks like it matches up pretty well. And so with all of that archaeological information and Alexander Molodyn's drafting skills, we can actually draw a relatively good idea of what these structures inside looked like. And so when we're doing new interpretations at the fort, one of the things I want to point out are what we've learned from the archaeology and from the ethno history, and point to these things that could very well have Hawaiian meaning. Right by the entrance to the fort is this large, oblong, upright stone built into the walls. It has no purpose in Western architecture, but anybody who knows Hawaiian cultural history and upright stones can understand the significance of that. The platform where the flag post is, that was sort of, you can't really see anymore. It's not just a pile of rock, it was actually tiered. Looks very much like a ahu inside. And that ahu, if you understand that that's where the flag post was, you'd say maybe they did that because the bedrock and they couldn't put guy wires to hold up the pole. The soil there was very deep and they easily could have put it up with guy wires. But if you look at this as an ahu in the middle of a heiau, suddenly there's a great deal more significance to this place that might be different than the Russian interpretation that Schaefer gave. So in the end, I want you guys to see this amalgam of Western military architecture and Hawaiian architectural construction in the 19th century, and the symbolism and the meaning of a landscape that goes deep into the Hawaiian past and the sacredness of that to understand this place. And so that's the reason why I think we need a more balanced interpretation of this place. And that's sort of my wrap up, but I really want to thank the collaborators, in particular, Alex, who again has worked very closely with me for a number of years to try to make the 3D kinds of representations that you're starting to see online. All right, that's it. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Peter. We do have some questions, so and you can start, there you go. Thank you. It's really fascinating and it raises a lot of questions as well as answers many. So I'm just going to share some questions now. Let's see. Someone asked, Colin asked, what arms did the Russians use at the fort? Peter, you're on mute. The most used line of 2020. There you go.
There we go. Okay. Yeah. So there were certainly cannons that were on the ships that were brought ashore. The vessels that the Russians had started out as American vessels. And so the cannons that were there were probably mostly American munitions. the Russians had a really hard time getting iron and ships into the Pacific. They had to get all the material to build them pretty much across, from Lake Baikal across Siberia and across Kamchatka. And so a lot of the materials that Russians had as far as military wares and munitions were a hodgepodge of things that they could get from different sources. So we don't know exactly what they had. We do have inventories of a lot of the muskets and materials that were there in 1862 and 1864 when Valdemar Knudsen on the island of Kauai for the government started to dismantle the fort and take it apart. And to a call out, we recently got a new musket out of the fort that had belonged to the fort from a private collection from a family of Kauai that had had it in their family forever. And when we took a close look at the musket that was there in 1864, it was stamped K3, which stands for Kamehameha III. So it's one of the monarchy's muskets from Kamehameha III's era. And it was a percussion cap, which would be later. So I think a lot of the munitions that ended up there were really collected from so many different places by the 1860s. We don't know exactly how many munitions were left there that belongs directly to the Russian American company, but they had a number of vessels, but many of those vessels would have had American munitions on board.
Wow, that's really cool. Is there any significance, Hardy asked, is there any significance to the overall design of the fort's walls? Yeah, I had that question as well.
Yeah, okay, so Schaefer had been sort of around for the Napoleonic Wars and for other things. He was really skilled as far as an engineer. That star-shaped design that you see on the seaward side, again, the part that we pretty much know was built before Schaefer left, that's a style that's called, at least in Europe, it's called Tresse Italien. I love this. It's a French term that's referring to a Roman design of fortification that goes back to the Roman era that was in wide use across Europe at the time, including in Russia. And so what those star-shaped points allow you to do is actually not to put the cannons out on the far points of them, but to put them in the recesses. And if you put them in the recesses, a cannon can sort of create crossfire across the fort walls, right? So that design of having those star-shaped things and mounting cannons in the recesses creates a lot of crossfire along a wall that you might think would be under siege. And that's probably the main reason why it has that star-shaped design.
Wow, that's very creative design. How long did Schaefer own Honolulu District? Tanya would like to know that.
Okay, so let's talk about this issue of ownership too, and realizing that we're talking about 1816, right? In the 1816 era, pretty much in the Aikapu era, there was no idea of fee simple land ownership, even for chiefs. So like even Ali'i Nui, when they died, lots of times land would be redistributed, right? So that there would be battles between surviving chiefs to see who would control. And that was a part of normal cultural practice. So the idea of even an Ali'i Nui signing away to a foreign nation, any land in perpetuity is something that didn't exist in Hawaiian culture. That's what the papers that Komolei put his marks on said, but that was a very Western concept of land that didn't even exist at the time that Komolei was there. There's an article that Alex and I have coming out in Asian Perspectives that talks a little bit about this principle that existed at the time. So basically the short story is it really was late 1816 that Schaefer had started to build up there in Princeville, but he was booted, again, the Russian American company as a whole was sort of forcibly removed from the island in 1817. And at least in Komolei's mind, regardless of what papers said in perpetuity, that was the end of the Russian American company's control of Honolulu in any Hawaiian cultural sense. But the documents themselves are expressing, at least the paper versions are expressing a perpetual ownership.
Alyssa asked, if the Russians weren't really around, why did they raise the Russian flag during the 1820s?
They didn't, actually. And so the Russian flag was only raised in 1816 and 1817. And so when a quotation by Whitney was referring to raising the flag on public occasions, it was referring into the past, into the time that the Russian American company was there. Interestingly, in 1817, when Kamehameha and the Americans, who were spreading all sorts of rumors about the Russians on Kauai, were starting to exert their force to try to get Schaefer kicked off of the island in 1817, Alexander Adams, who was the head captain for Kamehameha's own Western style vessels, sailed into Waimea on the Ka'ahumanu on his way to Canton, and he left with Schaefer a flag and said, "Here, raise this flag and get that Russian one down." And so right as soon as Schaefer left the island, there's a record in Schaefer's journal of a new flag being raised at the fort that of a symbols that Schaefer didn't know. It was sort of like this ball with these 4 sections on the outside of it. And so that was probably either a navigational flag or another kind of flag, which Adams had left with Komolei, and that's what was flown outside the fort for at least a little while in 1817 and after.
Wow. Elizabeth asked, what happened to Hume? Was he killed in the battle?
Hume was not killed in the battle. He ended up being, there were many people who were killed in that battle. So there are lots of stories on Kauai of just how awful the slaughter after the initial confrontation was. But Hume was captured up in the mountains in the hills and brought back to Oahu as a prisoner of Kalanimoku, and he was treated. He was not killed on purpose, and he ended up, I think, dying. I would have to look up the year, but I think he died in 1826.
Makalena asked, she said, aloha, you mentioned during your presentations that there were burials at ula ula. During your excavations, did you find iwi?
Absolutely not. And that was by choice. There were places where it seemed pretty obvious that there were burials, and even coming as a Malihini, who was relatively new, 30 years ago, sort of when I first started coming here, there's no way that we wanted to come close to actually exposing burials to prove any of our points. So where we did our testing was sort of away from there, away from places where there were burials that we knew of. Whenever you're working in the ground, there is always the case, whether that's a construction project or it's archaeology, there's always a chance that iwi kupuna could turn up. We actually had some Native Hawaiian archaeologists from Kauai working with us, and anything that seemed at all sensitive, I deferred to them to try to make the decisions on how far to proceed. In one case, we were working above where we thought the burials were, and it was their decision on sort of like where to stop, and we stopped before we exposed any iwi kupuna. That's practically the way that I've led my life since I've been here. I'm not into exposing iwi kupuna for an archaeological project.
Thank you, Peter. Mark asked, how would you approach introducing the history of the fort to young people?
I think one of the ways which I would approach it is trying to explain, even to young people, that 2 different sets of people can look at the same place different ways, right? You don't have to find the one and only truth about what a place means or what its value is in a particular culture. I completely get why people of Russian ancestry and Russian Americans in particular would find so much of interest and value in this place. And that point's been driven home so many times that they genuinely have a love for this history in this place because of the connections to their own ancestry and their own background. But one of the things that needs to be balanced against is how can that love be balanced against a recognition of this sacred place and of this very different kind of interpretation and meaning to people who have a Hawaiian cultural connection to this place. And so I think even for kids, even from an early age, should understand that there isn't just a pure right and a pure wrong in history or in anything in life, and that what we have to do is find a way to fairly represent different perspectives on the same place.
Thank you, Peter. I think that's a really beautiful expression, to be able to hold space for more than one perspective, because history is complex and there are different peoples involved. So that's really, really well said. Susie asked, she said, thank you for the talk, and asked if you're continuing to dig and discover things there.
To make a long story, you could probably go to my Hilo webpage and see, but I did this work in most of the field work I did in 93 and 94. And once I became a Hilo professor on the Big Island, I really tried to work for my local students who couldn't fly to Kauai that easily, and I really focused a lot more on Big Island sorts of projects. I still have a deep love in my heart for this place, and I've continued to work there on small projects. We searched for one of the cannons from the fort using side scan sonar in Waimea Bay back in the early 2000s. And I've done a lot more ethno history in recent years, again, largely due to Alex and the renewed interest in the 200th anniversary. Again, this new article coming out in Asian Perspectives will sort of give an update on what you find in the book. I for the most part, though, I'm pulled in so many different directions that I would like people of Kauai from that island and from Kauai Community College and other people who are directly tied to the place, really to make the decisions about how this place should be worked on in the future. Happy to advise and help at any point, but I haven't turned it into a lifelong site for me to go dig in.
Thank you, Peter. While we do have several more questions, I also want to be respectful of your time because we're already over. I mean, if you want to answer a few more, we could keep going, or maybe, yeah, okay.
I'm good.
Sharon asked, wondering where did the stones for the walls come from and the ula ula right there from the river, question mark, how far away?
Yeah, I think most of the ula ula is easily gathered along some of the gravel bars along the mouth, along the Waimea River. The shape of the mouth of the Waimea River has changed somewhat with the building of an Army Corps of Engineers sort of a flood control there earlier part of this in the 20th century. But I think a lot of that was right there. I think a lot of the pohaku are probably ones that were used in other structures. And so one of the things that, even though you don't see it in Ellis's drawing, Ruggles, Samuel Ruggles, one of the two missionary families that ended up living there, described that location right where Komolei's own Kauhale was where there had been an important morai in the past, or an important heiau in the past. And so I really think a lot of those stones probably had been part of heiau in the past that were just remodeled in some cases. In fact, might actually still even be built into the fort walls. And so some of it might be remodeling of heiau that had been there before the fort was ever built. All of the stone in general could easily be coming out of Waimea Canyon. There's a tremendous amount of it that's available. Some of the stones in the fort wall have been rounded from sort of either being in the river or on the shorefront. And so I think a lot of it's probably river boulders. Yeah.
It's really interesting. Greg asked, is there any evidence that the star shape coincides with Hawaiian astronomical alignments?
None. And one of the things about building the fort is that one of the accounts suggests that Schaefer acted as an engineer in constructing it and putting it up. So I haven't done the Hawaiian astronomical alignments, but so far there's no straightforward evidence. I've looked out at the points, I've looked at the rising and setting, but I haven't done anything official. It would be a great project for someone to take on.
Sounds great. Ken asked, and I won't be able to read the excerpt, but he just wanted to know if you've seen the September 2nd article in Institute of Modern Russia online magazine. And
I don't think I have. I've seen some online Russia magazines in the past, but I haven't seen one from just September 2nd. Absolutely not.
Okay. So what I'll do is he provided the link and I can send that to you. So Ken, I'll provide that to Peter and then he can, maybe take a look at it and respond back to you with any of his thoughts on that. Let's see. Just a lot of mahalos. Tanya asked, said thank you for the talk and was wondering in regards to the papers of ownership from the 1800s, do they still hold any legal standing today?
I would say absolutely not. I don't think they held legal standing at the time because there was no legal authority, even for King Komolei, to sign over rights in perpetuity to Hawaiian land.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, maybe this will make this the last. Phil had asked right in the beginning when you started speaking, can you talk about Russian trade ships regularly, continuously stopping in Hawaii into the 1860s? And he asked, didn't the Russians having trading stations. Didn't they have trading stations as far south as Los Angeles?
Okay, so let me back up just a little bit there. I might have been misheard or misspoken. I don't. The Russians. There were different Russian traders who did come through Hawaii for a very long periods of time. There certainly were coming through in the 1860s, but to say that it was regular would probably be an overstatement. I mean, British and American and French, and to some degree, South American traffic was very common as sort of through the hide and tallow era in the 1830s and whaling. And there were there were certainly very good relations for a while in underneath Kamehameha III between Kamchatka and the Hawaiian Islands in terms of trade relationships. There was some very close friendships that had in fact built up between chiefs in Hawaii and Kamchatka in particular. So that did sort of continue, but it wasn't that when Schaefer was looking to establish this as one of the sort of Russian Russian-American company colonies, he was interested both in the sandalwood on the island and also cultivation and food, because if you look at Fort Ross in California, they'd hoped to grow wheat there, and the wheat just didn't grow well in Northern California with all the fog on the coast. And I think they were still looking for places where they could expand out Western style food production for the colonies in Alaska. And so I think that remained an interest of Russians in here. As far as California, you did have, at least in the later 1800s, after the Spanish, after the sort of end of the mission era in Spanish California, you did have Russians, for instance, in the 1830s, that built a bread oven on the beach in Southern California, like where they would grow. Richard Henry Dana Jr. writes about that particular thing. But as far as formal establishments, Fort Ross in Jenner, California, which is about an hour north of San Francisco, is as far as you actually had a colony. It's sort of like an outpost that was permanent and set up by the Russian American company. And all of that sort of ends in 1842. So you sort of have, that's sort of when the Russian American company gets out of California, sells that land to John Sutter, the same guy as Sutter's Mill, where the gold was found in 1848. 1842, the Russians pack up, from Jenner in 1848, Sutter's gold is turning up. So anyway, that's all sort of that era there. But yeah, the Russians were certainly still very active in Alaska through the late 1860s and Treaty of Sessions. And all of that stuff was still going on. And there was they were still very much a presence in the Pacific.
Thank you, Peter, so much. I'm sorry, everyone. I acknowledge all the wonderful comments and appreciations and additional questions everyone's been sending in, and really want to thank you for that. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but it's such an interesting topic, and Peter did such a great job that there's a lot of questions generated. But I just want to take a moment to thank everyone so much for joining us this evening. And thank you to the Friends of King Kaumoali'i for partnering with us on this presentation. I want to thank my colleague, Michelle Kisik, who's been monitoring the technical support aspect in the chat. And I also want to take a moment, of course, thank Dr. Mills for an absolutely wonderful and really intriguing conversation and sharing of the research that he's been doing. And he's clearly very passionate about it, and it makes us very passionate too. We invite you to join us for our next virtual event, which is kind of similar in the sense it's about how do we share memorial sites and monuments of difficult histories in this case, but it's a panel discussion, and it's going to be exploring complicated histories. And the panel will include Mainette Benham, Kamana Beamer, Melanie Eid, and Conrad Ing, and it will take place on Wednesday, September 23rd from 4:30 to 6. And also, just again, a reminder for those who are new to us, please consider signing up for our e-newsletter so that you can hear about these events and other related topics. And also, please consider supporting HHF and our work. There's many ways to do that, and just want to say that your support means a lot, especially in these times. And you can go to the Join Me section on our website, and if you feel so inclined, become a member or donate. And also want to just say wishes to everyone to stay safe and to enjoy the rest of your evening rather. We hope that you and your loved ones are navigating these times with the support that you need and resilience. We're grateful to be able to gather and share these wonderful presentations, and we wish you to stay healthy and inspired. So with that, I will say good night to everyone and hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you, Dr. Mills. Thank you, Peter.